In our last session, we studied about the process of digestion that takes place in the stomach. Now, inside the stomach, we have the acidic content. We have the acid, we have a special digestive enzyme called pepsin, we also have mucus. And these contents, when they are mixed with food and the food is solubilized and digestion is taking place, this food that is present in the stomach, which is acidic, is called the chyme, right? Just a little reminder, chyme. What makes the chyme? Bolus. And where is the bolus present? It is present in the esophagus. Now, very rapidly, let's do a very little revision of what we've done so far. The process of nutrition in human beings is divided into 5 steps. Number 1 is ingestion, number 2 is digestion, third is absorption, fourth is assimilation, and fifth is egestion. This word here, this term here is wrong. It's not excretion, it is something else. It is called egestion, Gestion. So it's not excretion, it's egestion. So there are these 5 stages involved in nutrition in human beings. Where does ingestion takes place? The organs that are involved in ingestion are the mouth and its parts, such as the teeth, tongue, and to a certain extent even the saliva, which is produced by the gland, by the salivary glands. Right? Now these are the organs involved in ingestion. Along with this, let's write number 1. Along with this, another organ called the esophagus. Esophagus, or the food pipe, is involved in the process of ingestion to take the food inside. Now the ball of food is found in the esophagus. It is formed in the mouth. But that is pushed down into the esophagus. From the esophagus, the bolus reaches the stomach, where it is called the chyme. And let us now proceed further to the second stage of nutrition in humans, which is digestion. Now, where does digestion begins? The digestion begins in the mouth. I hope you remember. And then the second organ where digestion continues is the stomach, right? And the third organ and the last organ that is involved in the process of digestion, where most of the digestion takes place, is the small intestine, which we will study today. So the small intestine is the place where most of the digestion takes place. What is the other function of the small intestine? So we've just learned for the first time that digestion takes place, most of the digestion takes place in the small intestine, and also absorption takes place in the small intestine. What is absorption is what we will come to in our next session. But today we'll try to understand the process of digestion in the small intestine. Now let us proceed a little bit further, and we'll talk about absorption, assimilation, and egestion in our later classes. Let's proceed a little further. Now let us try to understand the story right here. I'm going to magnify the image for you. First of all, let us read a couple of things that are written here on the whiteboard. Today's objective is to study the digestion that takes place in the small intestine, what is happening there, and how does it take place. So before we even proceed here, let us first of all understand let us revise what are the different nutrients that are present in our food. So carbohydrates and proteins and fats, right? I'm writing prot for short and carb for carbohydrates, and then we've got minerals and vitamins, right? So these are the 4 classes of nutrients that we have. Now there are wide varieties of complex carbohydrates and simple carbohydrates also that we eat. For example, we all must have tasted glucose, right? The energy drink, the component found in the energy drink. So that's a simple carbohydrate, we don't need to digest it anyways. But our food contains a wide variety of complex carbohydrates. One major complex carbohydrate, which is also a source of glucose for us, is called starch. Starch is a complex carbohydrate. Similarly, there are a large number of other complex carbohydrates. One such example is cellulose. Cellulose, unfortunately, we cannot digest, right? But starch we can. Similarly, there are a wide variety of other carbohydrates such as maltose, etc., etc. So there are wide varieties of carbohydrates and we need to digest them. Some of the carbohydrates we cannot digest because our body does not have the enzymes to break them down. But starch must be, and maltose can be. So what has happened so far in the process of digestion? So in the mouth, some of the starch, we eat a lot of starch, your potatoes and rice, etc., are full of starch. So only 5% of the starch that you eat is digested in the mouth. Only 5%, very little. 95% of the starch is still left behind. Along with this, huge amounts and varieties of carbohydrates are still left in your food that have entered your stomach. In the stomach, the carbohydrates are not digested, right? They are solubilized, they are made simpler to digest, but they are not broken down into simpler carbohydrates. But what happens in the stomach? What part is broken down in the stomach? Stomach acts on proteins primarily. So some kinds of proteins are directly converted into amino acids, whereas the other proteins are simply converted into simpler proteins. So there is a lot of protein still left in the food after stomach. There are a lot of carbohydrates that are leaving the stomach. So basically what I'm trying to say is the chyme that is present in the stomach still has a lot of proteins. Yes, it has some amino acids. The chyme still has a lot of carbohydrates. Yes, it has a little bit of maltose. Maltose, do you remember from where? The enzyme called amylase in the mouth digests starch. It breaks down the starch into a simple carbohydrate called maltose. This maltose is made up of two glucose units, two glucose molecules. It still needs to be broken down. So anyways, chyme is still rich in lots of carbohydrates, lots of proteins, undigested proteins, and nearly all the fats are still intact. They have not been digested at all. So chyme has still a lot of nutrients, a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of proteins, and all the fats that have not been digested so far. And this is where small intestine comes into action. And today we'll see what small intestine does. So here we have the small intestine. So let us just very slightly magnify the image so that I can show you the stomach. So here we have got the stomach, right? This is the stomach, and this is the opening of the stomach. I hope you remember what we call it. If you don't remember, let me give you the name of this gate. This gate here is called the sphincter. Sphincter. The stomach has two sphincters. So anyways, once the chyme is here, and let us now also draw the chyme in yellow. Let us say this is the acidic food, acidic chyme, in which proteins have been digested, carbohydrates, some of them are digested, most of them are undigested. There still are a lot of fats. So now after 3 or 4 hours, this chyme is going to enter into this intestine, and this is the intestine here, right? So this is the beginning of the small intestine. This is the starting point of the small intestine, and then the small intestine continues down here, down further. So you can see the small intestine is highly coiled, very long. Why is it long is what we will look at in some time. So now when the chyme enters the small intestine, remember chyme is acidic. So intestine also has its own share of mucus, but it does not have a lot of mucus, so the chyme can damage it. The chyme can damage it. Also remember, if the chyme was not acidic, the pepsin will not function. Pepsin, the enzyme, it will not have become functional in the absence of acid. So acid is also important for activation of pepsinogen to pepsin. This enzyme, basically pepsin, can only work in the presence of acid. So once this chyme moves into the small intestine, the cells of the small intestine, let me just rub this part here now. So this, let's magnify it just a little bit more. So now the cells that are the cells of the small intestine here, the cells in the wall of the small intestine at this beginning, they, when the acidic chyme gets in, they detect that an acid has entered us, that an acidic substance has entered us, and these cells, they send a signal to the brain, to your brain. They send a signal to your brain, and what signal they send? That we have received acid in the small intestine. Once the brain knows that the acid has been received, acidic chyme is entering the small intestine, the brain gives a signal to the gallbladder and the pancreas. And this signal, the brain tells the gallbladder and pancreas to release their secretions. What are secretions made up of? Secretions are made up of, again, digestive enzymes and other chemicals. So I hope this much is clear to you, that what happens when chyme enters the small intestine and why. Signal is sent to the brain tells the gallbladder and pancreas to release their secretions. And what are the secretions made up of? Digestive enzymes and other chemicals. Now let us just come back, rub this off and demagnify it a little and go to our next slide so that we can see these two organs in a little bit more detail. So let us demagnify it just a little bit more and arrange the slide properly. Yep, here we are. Now we go to the next slide here. So here we have the pancreas and the gallbladder very clearly shown. So this yellow organ here, right, that looks like a kind of a leaf, is the pancreas, and this green structure here, this green bag-like structure, is the gallbladder. Now let us talk about their role in digestion. So gallbladder receives two tubes openings from the liver. So can you see this particular tube here and this tube here? Both of them are connected to this particular organ called the liver. And let me just draw a rough liver for you. So this is a big massive organ called the liver, right? So liver appears like this. So this, let us say this is the liver. So, and this is just behind the and on top of the gallbladder. So liver, it makes two very important group of chemicals. Liver makes something called as the bile juice and bile salts. Now the bile juices are rich in we'll talk about these. What do these do? Let us not talk about what they are rich in, but rather simply what their function is. Now the liver makes bile juices and bile salts, and both these bile juices and bile salts are transferred by the liver, and let's use a red marker. They are transferred by the liver, and the liver is transferring them and sends them here into the gallbladder. So liver sends them into the gallbladder, and these two bile juices and bile salts are then stored in the gallbladder. So liver is the factory where these two are produced, and the gallbladder is the storage area where bile juices and bile salts are stored. Now let me just rub it a bit. I hope now you remember what is present inside the gallbladder. So once the brain signals the gallbladder and the pancreas to release their digestive juices, the gallbladder releases, let's use a red marker again, the gallbladder releases the bile juices and bile salts into this tube. You see this green long tube? This green long tube is called the bile duct. And these two juices, which I am now kind of drawing in red, the bile juice and the bile salt are in red, both of them are released into this tube. A tube, the scientific term for a tube is a duct. So duct is nothing but a tube. So these two components then move through a tube, and this tube is called the bile duct, and these juices are then released into the small intestine. So this is the small intestine where this juice is being released. And if you remember, we have acidic chyme traveling down. So the acidic chyme now mixes with these bile juices and bile salts. Now what do the bile juices do? The bile juices will cancel the acids. We don't use the term cancel, we use the term neutralizes. It neutralizes the acids. So the bile juice will neutralize the acid. So the acid that is present in the chyme is no more acid. Okay? Why? Because bile juices are alkaline. If you don't want to remember this, that is perfectly fine. Let's just cancel this out. I want you to only remember that the bile juices are going to neutralize the acid, so the chyme is not acidic anymore. Now there are two benefits. There are two benefits of neutralizing the chyme, of cancelling the effect of the acid in the chyme. There are two benefits. Number one, the small intestine is protected from the effects of the acid. So protection of small intestine from acids is the first effect of bile juice, or the first function of bile juice. Bile juice neutralizes the acid, and because of this, the small intestine is protected. The second important function is that the digestive juices, pay attention to what I'm about to say, and let's use the digestive juices that are present in the small intestine now. There are a lot of enzymes that the small intestine will produce. There are a lot of enzymes, digestive enzymes, that the pancreas will produce. There are some other enzymes which are produced, which are then released into the small intestine. Now these enzymes cannot function in the presence of an acid. So if acidic chyme comes down there, these digestive enzymes cannot work and the process of digestion will not take place. So the bile juice neutralizes this acidic chyme and allows, the second function is that it allows the digestive enzymes released by the pancreas and the stomach to act. They'll be able to function. They'll be able to function really well. Right, so this is the important aspect of it all. Right, so let us proceed a little bit further. I hope you've understood the function of the bile juice. Now we come to the second component, which are the bile salts. Now the bile salts are also released by the gallbladder, but where are they made? They are made in the liver. Now what is the function of the bile salts? We are coming to bile salts. Let me just rub off this area a bit so that we can make a little writing space for our own cells. Now the chyme that is coming, it is rich in fats also, and fats have not been digested at all so far. They have not been digested in the mouth, not in the stomach, and now they must be digested. Now if you have ever dropped so what are fats? Fats are nothing but oils and solid fats such as ghee and butter, etc., etc. These are all fats. So I hope you've observed that when you put a drop of oil on top of water, let's say this is a tumbler of water, if you drop oil into it, the oil simply floats on top of this. The oil floats on top of the water like a thin film. But if you put only a couple of drops, you will find, if you put in a couple of drops of oil, you will find that these oil droplets are found like these tiny drops. They are found floating in these form of these drops. So the fat that enters the food, the fat that is in the that enters the intestine, is found in the form of large droplets. Let me rub all of this. So the fat that is entering the small intestine is found in the form of large drops called fat globules. Fat globules are large, big drops of fats. So your ghee is like that, your oils, the ones that you consume like your mustard oil, etc., they are like that. Big fat globules. Now, in order for the digestion of fat, these large droplets must be broken down into smaller drops. And how can these large drops be broken down into smaller drops? By the action of something called as bile salts. So the bile salt breaks down these large fat globules into smaller fat droplets. Large globules, large big drops into small drops, and now we get these very tiny drops of fats. And this process of breaking down of big fat globules, the breaking down of big fat globules into smaller fat droplets is called emulsification. So what is emulsification? The breakdown, don't call it digestion, call it breakdown of large or big fat globules into small fat droplets is called emulsification. Now you must be wondering how breaking it into smaller pieces will make digestion easy. Let us take an example. Imagine when I come to your class, I give you a big candy, and the size of the candy is as big as your school bag. I give you one candy that is the size of your bag, and I ask you to eat it. Now how long are you going to take to eat the whole candy the size of your bag? Now if you have to finish it, you'll have to lick it and suck it and break it down. So you will take a lot of time to eat that, right? Because it is not manageable. You can not put the entire bag sized candy into your mouth once and then eat it and chew it and break it down. But if I take this bag and break it down into thousands of small tiny candies, won't it be easier for you to chew them and sour them, right? So that is the same logic here. The big fat globules are broken down into small fat droplets by the bile salts, and this process is called emulsification. So, what is the function of the accessory organ called gallbladder? So, the gallbladder performs three functions. First, storage. Sorry, two functions. The first function is storage of bile juices and bile salts. The second function is the release of bile juices and bile salts. So first function is storage of these two, and second function is the release of these two. Now what are the functions performed by the bile juices and bile salts? The bile juices, they neutralize the acidic chyme, and the bile salts, they emulsify fats. They emulsify fats. They emulsify fats. And give me a moment. I think I have we are back. I thought I had stopped the recording. Anyways, proceeding further. So what we have understood so far, we've understood the process of the functioning of bile juices and bile salts, or the role of gallbladder in the liver. So we have understood this. Now what is the function of the pancreas here? The pancreas. So this is the organ called pancreas. Now pancreas is a very complicated organ. Okay, it is not simply a storage organ. It produces digestive enzymes and some other things that you will study later. So it produces its digestive enzymes, and then it also releases. Now if you look at this long tube here, this is this long tube. So this is also called the duct. You see? So the digestive enzymes. So let me just rub and clean the board, because now we are going to study about the pancreas. So let us just clear this up. So now the pancreas is going to produce its own secretions. And what are those secretions of the pancreas? So pancreas secretes digestive enzymes. Digestive enzymes. And which ones are secreted by the pancreas? So number one, it secretes amylase. Rings any bell? Amylase is secreted in the mouth also, and that is secreted by the salivary gland, and we call that amylase which is secreted in the mouth as salivary amylase. And that salivary amylase digests how much of starch? 5%, around nearly 5% of starch. But now 95% starch is still in the food. Now who's going to digest that starch? The amylase enzyme produced by the pancreas and released by its duct into the small intestine. Right? So this amylase secreted by pancreas is called pancreatic amylase. So the first secretion of the pancreas is pancreatic amylase. What are the other enzymes or digestive juices secreted by the pancreas? Number two are something called as proteases. Ah, you're scared. But proteases are also enzymes which break down proteins to amino acids. Simple, proteases. Third, you remembered, I hope you remember that what is chyme rich in? So chyme is still rich in a lot of carbohydrates, undigested proteins and undigested fats. So the pancreas now also produces another group of enzymes called carbohydrases. Proteases, carbohydrases. Any guesses what carbohydrases digest? Yes, they digest carbohydrates, complex carbohydrates into simpler carbohydrates. So it is the intestine where glucose molecule, simple carbohydrate molecules like glucose are formed from complex carbohydrate molecules. The last component or the complex nutrient that still is in the food are emulsified fats. Yeah, simply we must simply write fats, and fats must be digested into fatty acids. We have done this before. I want you to remember this. Fats are digested into fatty acids and something called as glycerol. Right? Not glycerine. We find glycerine back home. It is somewhat similar to that. That's called glycerol. Right? So we got fatty acids and glycerol. Now, what is secreted by the pancreas that will digest fats? The name of those enzymes? Fatases? No, unfortunately here we don't call them fatases. We call them lipases. So very quick revision again. What are the four secretions of the pancreas? pancreatic amylase, proteases, carbohydrases, and lipases. Now, if you think for a little while, amylase is a type of a carbohydrate because amylase also digests a carbohydrate called starch to maltose. So, pancreatic amylase is a kind of a carbohydrate. So don't be intimidated. Try to remember as much as you can. You should know at least the four secretions: pancreatic amylase, protease, carbohydrates, lipases. What do they do? Proteases break down proteins to amino acids, carbohydrates to simpler carbohydrates, lipases to fatty acids to fats to fatty acids and glycerol. Now, all of these processes are going to take place here onwards. Let me use a blue highlighter here. So here onwards, this process of digestion is taking place. Why here onwards? Because the chyme is getting mixed. The chyme is getting mixed with bile salts, bile juices, and the secretions of the pancreas, which are called pancreatic juices. Pancreatic juices. So in the intestine, all of the components present in the food are finally digested. I hope all of this is clear to you. We'll go for a very quick revision in this slide about whatever we have done. So digestion in the small intestine, we get chyme from the stomach. The chyme enters the small intestine. The small intestine sends a signal to the brain. The brain signals the gallbladder. It also signals the pancreas to release their secretions. What are the secretions that are released? Bile juices and bile salts are released by the bile juices and bile salts are released by the gallbladder. Number 2, pancreatic juices, which are amylases, protein and fat digesting enzymes, are released by the pancreas. And now third, we are doing the last one, the intestine itself. Now let's magnify here. The intestine itself, let's use a highlighter. So this is the intestine, the whole long thing here, this highly coiled structure, this whole intestine here, which then enters the large intestine somewhere here. This whole small intestine also releases its juices, which are called intestinal juices. Give me a moment, let's fix the slide. Yep. So now the intestine is also releasing its juices. And what are the secretions? What do the secretions of the intestine contain? It again contains the same thing. It contains proteases, carbohydrases, and lipases. Very much similar to the secretions of the pancreatic juice. Right, and it is because of the proteases, carbohydrate, lipases of the intestine, as well as the proteases and lipases, fat digesting enzymes, and amylase of the pancreatic juices, that all the three major classes of nutrients, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, are digested into their simpler products. I hope you've understood the process of digestion in the small intestine. In our next session, we will try to understand the process of absorption in the small intestine, and that is actually very interesting. Thank you.